you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here this morning, and thanks to Frank and the team at IDEA for inviting me. I was really excited actually by the topic, and I was quite challenged by it, in fact, because to try and synthesize what is, in fact, probably around 20 years worth of professional experience and some very recently more new experience in the women's movement into a kind of 10 or 15 minute speech has been quite challenging, but a good challenge for me, I think. So I'll just say a little bit about what is the European Women's Lobby, because I assume you might not know what that is. I joined as Secretary General a year ago, and the European Women's Lobby is the largest umbrella of women's civil society organisations in Europe. Represents probably, we don't really know, but about 2,500 women's organisations across the EU and in the accession countries, and includes also some sort of international women's organisations and alliances as well. And we work for a feminist Europe. So we are combining our strengths and our advocacy and lobby efforts to fight for a European Union that is a feminist European Union that puts gender equality at its core. And you might not know this, but that is actually, first of all, the Treaty of Rome called for equal pay between women and men. So that's nearly 60 years ago, and we're quite a long way from equal pay still. And the Lisbon Treaty actually puts equality between women and men as its second article. So it is supposed to be a very high priority in the European Union, and one which we obviously work very hard to maintain on the political agenda, although it's not always very easy, and I might come back to that a bit later. Our Irish member is the National Women's Council of Ireland, and they were very conveniently had their annual meeting, Feminist Futures, yesterday, so I was able to participate in that, and it was just so exciting to see a really vibrant and diverse what seems to be resurgent feminist movement in Ireland. Certainly that was the sense I got from yesterday's meeting. They'd had a big success trending on Twitter with their hashtag Feminist Futures, which had also featured in the newspapers and television and radio. And as a result, it had a whole load of new young feminists joining them. So there's something in the air, and I think they were also buoyed up by the fantastic result of the recent referendum in Ireland. So I can report back from the women's movement in Ireland as part of my words here as well today. But mainly what I've been asked to talk about is, what does universality mean? And what will it mean for the development education sector? And what can you learn from the women's movement? Women's movement, which is a historic, long-term, global movement, social movement, and one which I'm only just beginning to really understand the extent of it. So the questions I wanted to explore with you today really were, what can development education learn from our experience as a women's movement, as a global movement dealing in universality already? What successes and what pitfalls? I think I've got more of the pitfalls than successes, but you might even be able to remind me of some of our successes. What do the development education sector and development NGOs need to do to make universality actually make it work in practice? So I'm going to really draw there on my experience from ActionAid and Concord a bit to throw some challenges at you and explore some of those questions. You might have some more questions about that later this afternoon when I'm hosting one of the discussion tables as well. And then what about the role of development education in delivering in practice the idea of universality? And I'll talk a little bit about the DEEP work. I think you know DEEP, it's the Development Education Exchange in Europe programme. And their global processes on the concept of global citizenship. So that's the sort of stuff I'm going to try and explore with you today over the next 10 minutes or so. So when I thought about the challenging questions that Frank had given me and what the women's movement knows about universality, the main thing really that came to mind was the Beijing Platform for Action. So I don't know how many of you are that familiar with it, and I won't give you a lecture on that. But this was a universal human rights framework for women's rights that was agreed by all countries in Beijing 20 years ago. So the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and their universality is nothing new. This is 20 years of experience that we have as the women's movement and as women's rights activists within institutions and businesses and elsewhere of a universal comprehensive framework. So I thought that would be perhaps the best example I could bring here in terms of what we've learned from that. It was also, as the SDGs, born from a very participatory, grassroots up process, which included women's organisations, which included governments, which included institutions. But of course it was born at a very different time in history as well. Sort of mid-90s, there was, I think, a different atmosphere of hope post-Cold War and before the worst aspects of neoliberal capitalism have become entirely clear to us. So it was a different kind of hopeful time. But it's an interesting framework, and this year the women's movement have been organised and involved in reviewing progress 20 years on. So there is, I think, some interesting lessons there about how those universal frameworks can be a galvanising framework for governments, for action, and for civil society. And there's a kind of annual review, usually by most civil society organisations at national level, regional level, international level. But certainly every 5 years, there's a huge process of accountability and monitoring what's success, what's blocking in terms of the indicators that were set 20 years ago. So what can you say? There's certainly been a lot of progress on women's rights in 20 years, including in Europe. But there are so many gaps, and not one single country has achieved equality between women and men, not even Iceland or Sweden. And so it's really essential, and I think the new Sustainable Development Goals do speak to that if we're going to achieve women's rights, we get to the structural causes of gender inequality, the issues of violence against women, which are still so prevalent in every single part of the world, the issues of unpaid care work. I was already discussing that with some of you earlier, and your own experiences of the disproportionate responsibility for unpaid care work, both childcare and elder care, that falls on women. The limited control globally that women still have over assets and property and land, and the persistent and absolutely shocking unequal participation in political and private and public decision making. I was shocked yesterday to discover that only 16% of the members of the Irish Parliament are women. That's less than Afghanistan. Right? So there's a lot to do. There's a lot to do, and not just in Ireland. So and what's interesting about these issues is they are universal concerns. They're universal concerns from Afghanistan to Ireland about the persisting inequality between women and men, which is a human rights issue, but is also an issue of the kind of economy and society that we want. I wanted to say just a few facts about Europe as a whole, because when I worked for 12 years on global justice, and I've always been a feminist, you think, looking at the inequality between women and men in Africa, that Europe is kind of a paradise. So coming into this job, like literally every day, I have learned something new and shocking about the persistent inequality between women and men in Europe. I talked about the pay gap. I mean, that was supposed to be outlawed by the Treaty of Rome 60 years ago. And the average pay gap now, which means the different average hourly pay between women and men, is about 17% in Europe. But the gap in income, so the amount of money women take home versus the amount of money men take home, is 37%. And that's because women are more disproportionately in obviously low-paid, part-time, precarious kind of jobs. And the pension gap is 39%. In some countries in Europe, it's nearly 50%. And there, I'm talking about rich countries like Germany, where it's typical for women to take long periods out of the labour market to care for children and parents. Women in poverty, I'm not going to lecture you about the impact of austerity on women. I think you probably know that well enough in Ireland. But in the UK Gender Budget Group calculated that 75% of all austerity cuts came directly from women's incomes. 75%, and that wasn't because women had the most to start with, of course. I've talked already about power and the very, very small number of people women who are in power, in parliaments, in governments, as heads of states. It's a disputed statistic, but I still like to use it because it comes from the UN, which says that women do about 2/3 of all the work in the world for less than 10% of the income. And it may be that those figures aren't exactly right, but they're in the broad ballpark. We've got to do something different if we want a different kind of economy. So these are universal experiences. And what have we learned from Beijing? So this is the question really I thought I'd bring to you. Those universal frameworks are useful, actually, but we still haven't made that much progress. They're useful as monitoring and accountability frameworks, and they've been widely used by government and civil society to set standards and targets and to track progress. So there's a kind of accountability there. And it's happening across the world. So there's also opportunities within a global movement to share practice. What's worked, what hasn't worked. undisputed, they're really, really important. And there's an annual gathering around the Commission on the Status of Women in New York in March, where civil society actors and governments come together for 2 weeks. It's like some sort of massive, long Glastonbury festival of feminism, where actually we can talk to the new and emerging issues as well. So the new issues that are emerging that weren't even thought about 20 years ago. But the challenge is, progress is glacial. Even in the EU, we've seen in the last 7 years no progress overall on gender equality. And actually 8 countries in Europe are going backwards. And there are other countries where we know that progress on women's rights has gone backwards, and women are not even able to participate in politics or even education. A massive challenge has been clearly, over the last 20 years, the stranglehold of the globalised neoliberal economic system that has, increased corporate rights at the expense of human rights and has destroyed the planet as well. And all that's come with the collapse of that global economic system in terms of austerity has really pushed back women's rights. Everything from equal pay to violence, actually. There's been a lack of resources available for the delivery of the commitments of Beijing. So the question of where's the money, I think, and the appropriate means is one that you need to address as well and learn from us. The retreating political will. So it's easy to sign up to stuff in a global process, relatively easy, but actually changes in governments, changing in political cultures can make a huge difference, both positive and negative. And I think, and that's linked also for me to the closing civil society space that I think is a growing problem, including in Europe, but certainly in other parts of the world. Actually, for the women's movement, the MDGs were a massive step backwards. They were a huge step backwards from the successes of the Beijing Platform for Action, and created one huge diversion of resources and political will away from Beijing and towards the MDGs, which were not transformative goals at all, and were very much a north-south separate set of goals. So for the women's movement, the MDGs were not helpful at all. And then the other lessons, I think we feel that that Beijing stuff was really not adequately integrated into other political frameworks, so including in civil society. So I think that other civil society organisations have been very, very slow to realise and genuinely integrate the centrality of women's rights in the fight for equality, human rights, social justice and climate change. And I'm sure any feminist in the room who works in a mainstream NGO knows how difficult it is to bring women's rights into the centre of the discussion. And I've certainly something I've experienced a lot during my career is just sitting in that room full of very progressive people, including some women, but mainly men, who are all about ending capitalism and radical change. But when we talk about feminism and women's rights, we'll come to that later. There was a great person on the panel yesterday who was a feminist historian from Ireland who was talking about the role of women revolutionaries 100 years ago in Ireland, and how they were kind of promised lots of things, we'll get to you later, and the massive betrayal actually that women activists felt after independence here. So that's repeated across the world in every single social movement. And then the other thing I wanted to say really about the SDGs and lessons learned is that there seems to be politically a massive disconnect actually between what the EU is saying internationally in its negotiations towards the SDGs and what's going on internally in the EU. So they haven't seemed to work out what universality is going to mean. We're often having to point out to them that this is going to apply to them. So for example, they're currently drawing up a new action plan on gender, which will be applied to the external actions and development, but they're not drawing up a new strategy for equality between women and men internally. So it seems to me they haven't worked out politically what universality means to them. This has some huge lessons for us. So that brings me to the next question, which is about what does development education and development sector need to do to make universality in the SDGs a reality? I guess you all know Beyond 2015, which is the sort of global civil society alliance that's tracking all of this. And they've got a fantastic list of their red flags. I don't want to read them to you here, but I think if you look at some of those and ask yourselves, are we actually living up to those red flags ourselves? I think that would be a very good starting point. There are things like how we prioritise people and planet, how we integrate economic, social and environmental aspects of development, sustainable development, how we put gender equality at the centre of everything we do. There's a really great list. There's a great paper by the Beyond 2015 Coalition. It's like 3 pages of their red flags. I recommend it to you. And I just think, how we ourselves measure up to those things that we are asking governments to do would be a great starting point. From my experience in ActionAid in Concord, I think one of the big trends of the last 10 years has been really challenging ourselves in the development NGO sector about the divide between North and South and trying to dismantle that divide. Certainly, ActionAid was involved in a process already 12 years ago to create a global federation that had members around the world that were held accountable by national assemblies, which included social movements in those countries. So I think those and more NGOs are going down that path now, but at the time that was a really radical shift. I think all NGOs need to find new ways to engage with social movements, local, domestic and international social movements. That includes how do you engage with social movements in Ireland, as well as in other countries where you work. I think a much more emphasis on strategic and power analysis is needed, particularly when you look at alliance building. You're going to have to build whole new alliances, not just in a way that's instrumental, but that is fundamental to your theory of change. So it's actually part of what you do and how you do things. And organising across sectors and boundaries, anybody can say it and it can sound really nice to do, but it's really hard to do unless you put it at the centre of what you're about. It needs investment, it needs time, and it's not easy. I've been involved in those alliances, including in Concord, for a long time, and you need to put time and effort into it to make those things work. You need to listen to each other, you need to learn from each other, you need to be open. And that was only within the development sector. So trying to work with social movements, environmental movements, trade union movements, women's movements that come from a different background and a different DNA requires a very different kind of investment. I think we need to organise differently. We're going to challenge governments in Europe to both deliver on these universal goals in their own countries and in Europe and internationally. We're going to have to find whole new ways of organising ourselves. Looking at the goals both for supporting delivery here and for supporting delivery elsewhere, and not undermining actually the whole policy coherence for development, so do no harm approach as well. It's going to need a whole different kind of mindset. So I think new kind of structures might emerge to do like SDG watching or something like that. It would be interesting. But we lack actually effective global spaces for that as civil society. So even the women's movement, which is a global movement, we don't have a kind of global umbrella at all. So how are we going to do that across sectors? Maybe the last thing I wanted to say about what development education NGOs and development NGOs need to do to apply universality is to be much more critical in examining your own power and your own power in relation to others, other parts of civil society, your power and your resources, and how you work with others, particularly social movements and women's organisations in the South. Allowing yourselves to be much more challenged by stakeholders, much more open to change, and a whole new approach actually to accountability and learning. And obviously, you need to put women's rights and feminist analysis at the heart of what you're going to do if you're really serious about change. So my final bit now is, what role can development education have in delivering on universality? And I've seen sort of development education really changing and evolving over the last, I suppose, 12, 13 years I was involved in Concord, into something really quite exciting and transformative. These relatively new concepts of global citizenship and how all people in all parts of the world need to understand their role in a better planet and human rights. So I think it's been quite exciting. And maybe that was something you were always all about, but that sort of became much more apparent to me over the last 5 years or so. So I think development education has a very essential role to play in the delivery of the Sustainable Development Goals. I think an understanding of human rights, sustainability, issues like gender stereotyping really start in the education system. Education is essential. The churches have always recognised that, and it's not for nothing that often the backlash against women's rights, LGBT rights, sexual reproductive health rights starts with sex education and sexuality education and education about gender and challenging stereotypes. We see it across the world and across Europe. So education, lifelong education and citizenship education is essential. And the SDGs actually speak to that now. this really great language actually in Goal 4 that talks about the need for lifelong global citizenship learning, and I think that you should, if you're not familiar with that, it should be quite encouraging to all of you. But how important that is, that appreciation of cultural diversity, the environment is to global citizenship and to delivery of the Sustainable Development Goals. I think the development education has long understood had a focus on interdependence and solidarity, the local to global links. And I think, therefore, development education has a kind of expertise in universality, even if it hasn't called it that in the past, that could be used much more effectively by the development sector. And beyond that, with more these new, more integrated civil society alliances that I'm sure are going to start emerging. I think development education has a crucial role in public education, beyond the formal education, but public education and public understanding of what these new SDGs are and what universality means. As I said, our governments haven't worked that out yet, so somebody needs to help us explain that to them. And what it's going to mean for people in Ireland, in Belgium, in Afghanistan and globally. I think development education has a role also within development NGOs, or vis-a-vis development NGOs, and within governments to bring this expertise of universality into the new policy processes and into institutional strategies that the SDGs will require. I think really this whole evolution in the development education systems that I've seen around global citizenship, and I talked earlier about the deep processes there. I mean, it's been really exciting to see that concept of global citizenship emerging and really bringing together development education and campaigners, social movements to think about global citizenship. It's really exciting stuff going on. And if you haven't looked at it, I urge you to go and have a look at the DEEP website, because they've got some great resources on there and some great experiences. I think they've really sought to embrace the complexity of social and environmental change and justice, and the need for actually radical transformative change that's needed right now if we're going to save the planet and the people on it. I think it's really heartening, and a part of that process that you actually invited me here today to talk from a feminist perspective to this audience. It shows that there's a need really and a desire and a willingness to learn from others. So I think that in terms of global citizenship, look at the fourth goal of the Sustainable Development Goals and see how you find your place in that, because I think it's really, really inspiring piece for you to deliver on. But I think what you can do is really support the connecting of multiple complex interactions around various world crises that are happening into a single conversation about change, and actually about radical and transformative change. Defining a unity of purpose around struggles that have been traditionally stuck in silos. And we all need to contribute to that. I'm not throwing it on your shoulders, but I think you can contribute to that. I think without doing that, we're missing opportunities and we're wasting resources. We're wasting our resources, and we're having therefore less political impact. So we need to synchronise our efforts across borders and across sectors if we're going to have a greater and a faster impact. And we need to sort of move beyond our institutional interests that we still have as institutions in our own spaces, to build new rules and to build new alliances and to break old barriers if we're going to build a new, really global citizens movement. And of course, I think feminism needs to be a central part of that new citizens movement, and you'd be amazed how difficult it is to persuade people of that we're gonna have this fantastic transformative change, and we'll get to the women's rights stuff later. But feminism has all long known that we needed to go beyond GDP, that we needed to link ecological and economic and social goals. And if you really want a new economy, I'm very excited to see here, then that has to put women's rights at its centre and not be an optional extra, the cherry on the cake once we've had a bit of financial recovery. It needs to be really at the heart of a greener and more people-centred economy. So thank you very much.